Hello everybody, and as of the time of this recording, the survey for Playtest 7 of the 1D&D or D&D 5.5 playtest is officially open and available for the next few weeks. And so I'm going to be obviously taking this survey myself, and if you want to take it yourself, all you have to do is go to the D&D Beyond site, and if you go to Sources and Unearthed Arcana, you can go straight to here, you click on the latest playtest, and then you simply hit Take Survey. Now the survey is usually pretty long, especially with how big these playtest packets have been getting, so I highly recommend you maybe set aside a couple hours to really get into it if you plan on giving a lot of criticism. But before I take that survey, I figured that I would kind of round up my thoughts on the latest playtest, now that I've had a little bit more time to sort of think about and theory craft options based on the material, as well as do a little bit of playtesting myself, and talk to other people who have done their own rounds of playtesting. I figured this way, I can get some more ideas out there, give out some more criticism, and we can also further discuss it in the comments below. Because as usual, I'm always happy to hear what you guys have to say, and if you have any criticisms, or if you agree or disagree with any of the criticism I have to levy towards the playtest, by all means, I'd be happy to continue the conversation down below. And if you want to see me make more videos like this in the future, maybe you should give me a like and a subscribe so that you can check out more videos like this in the future. So without much further ado, I think that we should go ahead and get right into this. Now, just like my breakdown videos that I posted previous to this, and I'll probably link those in the description down below, I'm primarily going to be focusing on just the Barbarian, the Fighter, and the Warlock, and I'll leave timestamps in the description as well if you want to skip to the class that you want to hear the most about. And as just one last quick note, keep in mind I am going to be fairly critical in this video, as I'm going to be focusing on things that I either don't like or wish to see improved. Overall, I just want to say that I actually really like this playtest. I think that things are moving in the right direction, and just in general, if I don't mention something directly, then that probably means that I either like it or my complaints with it are so minor that I just didn't think of it at the time. So, without much further delay, let's go ahead and get started with the Barbarian. So, the Barbarian, like I said, has seen a lot of improvements. I really like things like the, new primal knowledge to make them useful at skill checks, and weapon masteries are a nice boon and things like that. But right off the bat, I have to say, my biggest complaint with the class as a whole is still Brutal Critical. This ability is so bad. And not only is this ability bad, it takes up 3 entire class levels where you get no other abilities but Brutal Critical, which is just absurd to me. And to really try and explain and hammer home just how bad this ability is, I'm gonna have to break out some math for you. So, Brutal Critical at its highest level, so keep in mind this is the final version of the ability that you get after wasting 3 entire class levels just getting this ability. You get a version of it that deals a bonus of 3d12 damage on a critical hit. Now, 3d12 sounds like a lot, and it kind of is. On average, 3d12 is about 20 damage. So, when you crit, you deal about 20 bonus damage on top of whatever normal damage you deal, which is pretty nice. The problem is that you only crit 5% of the time. Even with Reckless Attack, which lets you attack with advantage, that's only increases your chance to crit to about 10%. And when you factor that into account, that means that on average, the total amount of damage that you're dealing each turn only increases by 2 points. And that's it. And that's not 2 points per attack, that's 2 points overall for the round, because your chance of critting is still 10%. So, it's really bad. And, for example, rage damage alone, at the same level you get Brutal Critical, you get an increase to your rage damage, and then by the time you get the final tier of Brutal Critical, your rage damage has gone up by 2 points. So, the relatively minuscule bonus you get to damage from raging is literally a better feature than the bonus you get from Brutal Critical, because I was also rounding those numbers up. And like I said, at the first level you get Brutal Critical before it's even 3d12, it's only 1d12, which is an average of 6.5 damage. which means that with the fact that it only activates 10% of the time, that's a 0.6 point damage increase. For the, like, literally the extra point you get from Rage is twice as powerful as Brutal Critical is. It's basically Brutal Critical. I'm fine with it still remaining an ability. It's basically a flavor ability that makes it so that, like, when a Barbarian crits, they really hurt. And that's cool, and it's fun to use when it comes up, but it should not be the only thing you get at that level. There's a few ways I could see you could fix it. I mean, you could try to just increase the numbers, adding more dice when you crit, maybe even increasing your crit range so that you crit more often, and things like that, but none of those methods, in my opinion, are sufficient because it's still an incredibly unreliable ability that just happens at random. So you have zero control over it, which just makes it not exactly very fun to actually use, let alone waste an entire level's worth of features. In my opinion, what I would do is I would first move Relentless Rage down to 9th level to swap its position, then put Brutal Critical at 11th level, and then, like I mentioned in my Warlock video, I honestly think Barbarians, as well as Monks for that matter, should be getting a third attack at level 11. It would help make martials set themselves apart more from the sort of pseudo-martials like the Blade Singer or the Battlesmith, or even things like the Paladin and Ranger and whatnot, so that they get the most attacks, they can better use weapon masteries, and then getting Brutal Critical alongside a third attack would be absolutely fine. Another possible way that I could maybe increase it or implement it, especially at the higher levels, could be maybe you could just make it so that instead of it being on a crit, it's just once per turn, you could just deal an extra d12 of damage to somebody. I think that would be absolutely fine, and maybe you could even tie it to Reckless Attack, so that now, when you do a Reckless Attack, you can then, once per turn, increase your damage by a d12, or more d12s and whatnot, and then that way the trade-off for Reckless Attack only becomes better as you level up. But yeah, so obviously Brutal Critical needs to be improved, but one other thing that I don't think a lot of people talk about, and it's not really a problem with the playtest specifically, because they haven't changed it, and that is the core Rage ability itself. This has been pretty much unchanged for the most part, other than the fact that it's a lot easier to sustain it. And don't get me wrong, I definitely like the improvement where it's a lot easier to sustain. But one problem that I've always kind of had with how Rage works is that defensively, it's very weak in my opinion. Its defensive qualities are not very good. And on top of that, it also doesn't scale very well. Like, most of the abilities you get from Raging don't actually really change as you level. Like, think about it. The duration of your Rage stays the same from level 1 to level 20. The damage only increases by 2 points, so that barely gets better. You get advantage on strength checks, which is the same, and you get resistance to physical damage, which, again, doesn't really change all that much. So, if somebody's just dipping into Barbarian with multi-classing, then Raging is mostly as effective for them as it is for Barbarian, just short the rage damage and the actual number of times they can rage in a day. And that's always kind of the awkward thing about it, is that because rages only recover on a long rest, that means that Barbarians, of all people, kind of have a poor ability to sustain themselves throughout a long adventuring day, because they can't really recover their rages in any meaningful capacity. So, one thing that I would like to see improved with Rage is the ability to recover at least one use of Rage on a short rest. Now, I wouldn't give them this ability at first level, because again, that would make it way too strong for people multi-classing, but at some point, you know, probably before level 10, it would be nice if you could get an ability that lets you recover a use of Rage, you know, during a short rest. And then on top of that, I would love to see another defensive ability added to Rage that actually is better able to scale as you level. Like, you could argue that resistance to physical damage does scale with your level, because resistance is just a flat percentage damage decrease. So, as you take more damage from higher level enemies, resistance effectively blocks more damage. But arguably, in my opinion, rage actually becomes less defensive as you level, because since it only resists physical damage, as you reach higher levels, it only becomes easier and easier for enemies to bypass that resistance with various spells and magic abilities and just generally abilities that deal non-physical damage. And so as a result, the one defensive ability of Rage just becomes this binary where either the thing you're fighting deals physical damage and you can better tank their hits a lot more, or it doesn't, and you basically lose your one primary defensive ability. So, like, one possible change I could see is making it so that maybe Rage gives you temporary hit points. Either a large chunk of temporary hit points when you start raging that lasts until you end rage, or, in my preferred version of it, I would maybe give them a small amount of temporary hit points that only lasts for one round, but then it refreshes every single turn as long as you maintain your rage. So, for example, maybe it's something like your level plus your constitution modifier. So that at level 1, you probably only get like 4 or 5 hit points, or temporary hit points, I should say, from raging, but then at level 10, you can get up to like 15. And then that would be like enough that it makes a difference, but not so much that it would be impossible to chew through. And like that way, Rage would have another method of scaling as you level, so that a higher level Barbarian is notably different from a lower level one in terms of the strength of their Rage. And it would give them a less binary way of being more durable, since Barbarians are like meant to be the tanky class. Like, you're meant to be able to just absorb the most damage out of anyone. And I think temporary hit points would be a good way of representing that, because now, regardless of what type of damage your enemy is dealing, they have to go through your temp HP first, and then they can hurt your main HP. But it also doesn't negate damage resistance, because your damage resistance would still apply to that temp HP. So if somebody is dealing physical damage, your temp HP would effectively last twice as long. And even if you're playing, the Totem, or whatever it's called now, I think the Wild Heart Barbarian, where you get the bonus resistances from the Bear Totem, that would still be useful for buffing your durability as Rage, because that would, like I said, make your temp HP last longer. So, like, something along those lines to help make Barbarians much more durable while raging, I think would do a lot to kind of help support the fantasy of being this just wall of meat that refuses to go down, no matter how many times you get attacked. And it would just be a nice thing to have it scale better, and would better justify having an ability that also lets you recover on a short rest and things like that. So yeah, moving on to the subclasses. For the most part, I think these are actually pretty good, but I'll just touch on them really quick. For the Berserker, I know this is meant to be the sort of generic Barbarian, but I always felt like level 6 has many of the similar problems as Brutal Critical. Getting immunity to Charm and Fear while raging is really nice, but the problem is that it only matters, when you're dealing with things that can charm or fear you. So it's kind of this awkward thing where, like, it's very campaign dependent, I would say. Where, like, if you're in a campaign where you're fighting a lot of Fae and a lot of tricksters and whatnot, Mindless Rage could be really, really useful. But if you're in a campaign where you're fighting, say, a bunch of undead and necromancers and whatnot, then when is Mindless Rage going to really come up? I feel like they should get some other benefit while raging in order to make it more generally useful. One really simple change I think could work is the ability to get advantage on wisdom saving throws while raging, because that would be much more widely applicable. Like, sure, not everything does wisdom saves, but it's a hell of a lot more common than simple charm or fear effects, in my opinion. And it would be pretty flavorful, since like charm and fear is something that is typically associated with like willpower, and wisdom saves tend to represent the willpower of your character, and raging, giving you like infinite willpower to resist things would make sense. And then that way you can resist not just charm and fear effects, but mind control and all kinds of like weird, finicky, like confusion and things like that. Like all the weird stuff that wisdom saving throws usually protect you from. Mindless Rage could help you protect you from that. Moving on, Wild Heart. Like I mentioned in my original Barbarian video, I feel like some people are probably going to complain about Bear being nerfed. Thankfully, it doesn't look like too many people are complaining about it, so that's good. And I honestly do not think it's that bad that it was nerfed. Getting it, not protection, resistance against every damage type was, I feel, a bit much anyways, and this way it's a lot easier to justify taking other abilities at that level if you don't want to get just more durable. And I also think it's more tactical because like it encourages learning more about your enemies both in character and out in order to decide what two damage types you want to be resistant to. So I think that it's in general just a lot better to make it, you know, work this way. So I think that's fine. And then Path of the World Tree, like I said in my original video, I really like Path of the World Tree. I think it's very flavorful and cool. The one criticism I have really for it is that at level 14 you get this really awesome ability that lets you essentially cast plane shift as well as like a long range teleport once per day, which I think is a really cool ability to give to a class like the Barbarian for some really cool like out of combat utility. But the one problem I have with it is that it's pretty much exclusively a utility ability, which is, you know, like I said, it's nice that they get that, but most of the other subclasses, like the, you know, Zealot, you get something cool that you can use in a fight. In, you know, with the Wild Heart, you get another animal aspect that can give you more bonuses in a fight. With even the Berserker, you get Intimidating Presence, which gives you a new useful ability both in and out of combat. Like, but the World Tree Barbarian, like, they get all these cool abilities in a fight, but then their capstone has nothing to do with fighting, and that just seems kind of weird for the Barbarian. And I don't need it to be, like, some kind of insane damaging thing. They already get plenty of abilities like that. But, like, maybe getting something like a Misty Step equivalent, like a short-range combat teleport, I think would be a really nice way to give them something that fits in the same flavor as the long-range and cross-planar teleport that they already get, but that way they can actually get something that is useful in a fight to help improve their combat abilities on top of their utility. So something like that would be one thing that I would change. But yeah, other than that, I think that's pretty much going to do it for Barbarian. So moving on, I think we're going to move on to the Fighter. So moving on to the Fighter, like I said, there's a lot of good things. I think that they're moving in the right direction with a lot of features. I especially like that Second Wind is now back to recovering a use on a short rest. But there's definitely a lot of things to criticize that I didn't think about when I was first going over this playtest. So let's get right into it. So right off the bat, funnily enough, the first complaint I have is with the level 9 ability Master of Armaments, which just is kind of funny because my first complaint with Barbarian was with their level 9 ability. So I don't know what's going on at Wizards over there. Maybe they hate the number 9 or something, but they seem to be really bad at making level 9 abilities. So what Master of Armaments does, if you're not aware, is that it lets you essentially swap the mastery properties of different weapons that you're proficient with, so that, you know, like they use an example here, you can take a longsword and remove its sap ability and give it the push property. But the problem I have with this is that that almost feels like flavor more than anything, because like the actual increase in power is extremely limited in terms of like what this can do for you. Like, one way you can increase your power technically is if you have a magic weapon. Like, say you have a magic longsword, but you don't want to use the longsword sap ability with that weapon, you can give it the push property or whatever other ability you want to use, and that makes it more useful, I guess. But it seems like so weird that it would remove the existing ability, when in my opinion what they should do is you should just be able to add a new ability, and then you have multiple that you can choose from each time you attack, so that each weapon you have in your arsenal is at least more versatile. That still isn't even that strong of a buff, in my opinion, but it at least makes it so that it's an objective improvement over the weapon's existing status, instead of it being just changing their abilities around. And in fact, I would personally still split this into two different abilities. Like, maybe what I just described, where you're adding a second ability to a weapon, that could be a much lower level ability, because, like, level 9 is still pretty high up. Like, that's nearly halfway through your career, and again, keep in mind, most games only play up to, like, level 10 through 12 at the highest, and by the time you get that high, either the campaign ends or falls apart, or you start a new one in most games. So, like, only getting Master of Armaments at such a high level, when the fighter has been explicitly stated as trying to be designed as the best at using weapons, just doesn't seem like it cuts it for me. So what I would personally do is I would suggest maybe moving the level 9 ability that I suggested, where instead of replacing it, you add a second ability. Move that down to like level 5 or something when you get your extra attack, or maybe even slightly lower, like at level 3 when you get your subclass. Then, the new level 9 ability that I would give fighters is the ability to apply 2 mastery abilities to a single attack. So the idea is that you set up what, combos you're going to do with each weapon. So it's like, oh, you take the longsword and you have the sap and the push property. And then now, at level 9, you get the ability to apply both of those properties whenever you attack someone. This would make the fighters really stand out from other martials in how they interact with weapon masteries, and I think that would fulfill the stated fantasy of being the absolute best at weapon masteries, because simply getting more masteries than everyone else has very diminishing returns, in my opinion. Like, in all likelihood, the first 3 or 4 masteries are going to cover most of your needs, because you probably have a couple masteries that you really want to use, and then that will be the ones you pick early on, and then any extra masteries you get on top of that aren't really going to be that useful to you. Whereas this way, now the fighter really has a unique way of making themselves much more powerful, because now you can do things like cleave and push to push 2 people in a single attack. You could combine sap and slow to really just debuff somebody, or maybe topple plus slow could really just root somebody in place, because keep in mind, standing up uses half your movement, and then slow reduces your movement by 10. So, they probably only have 10 feet of movement after that point, which makes it impossible for them to chase somebody down. You could use Nick to get an extra attack with an extra ability on it. You could take Graze and actually make it useful offensively by making it so that when you miss, you activate Graze, but when you hit, you get to activate like Sap or Topple or something. It would just open up the door for a lot more interesting weapon combos, and it would make it really interesting. And it would still make weapons interesting and unique, because you wouldn't be able to replace the base ability of the weapon. So, like, longswords would still have sap, great axes would still have cleave, all that good stuff. But then you just add a different one. So your weapon choice still matters, but you're still going to do a lot more. And especially if, like I said earlier with Barbarians, like I still think that all of the main martial classes should get 3 attacks. And one problem with that suggestion is that it makes fighters weaker, because now one of their unique abilities of getting 3 attacks is just being handed out all willy-nilly to other classes. But with this kind of ability, where you get to apply multiple masteries, that would make it so that their attacks are much more unique to themselves and much more powerful. And while we're on the topic of weapon masteries, one criticism I kind of have for that system in general, I mean, I have a lot of criticisms for how weapon masteries work, but just to work within what we have currently, one problem is that I really feel like there's just not enough weapon masteries to really make the system as interesting as it could be. Like, if you actually count up all of the weapon mastery abilities, there's only 8, like, in total. Cleave, Graze, Nick, Push, Sap, Slow, Topple, and Vex. And that's it. And on top of that, a lot of these can only really be used once per turn. Cleave can only be used once per turn. Nick can only be used once per turn. Sap, while it can be used multiple times, it only applies on the first attack roll. So if you're only fighting one person, you can effectively only benefit from it once per turn. Same with Slow, you can only reduce it by 10 feet. So you can only use it once per enemy. Topple, once you topple somebody, they can't become more prone, so that can only really be used once effectively. And then all that really leaves is Push and Vex as abilities that you can use more consistently. And even then, Vex doesn't do anything if you already have advantage, like say from toppling them. And so that really only leaves Push, and even then, Push has a hard limit where if you're fighting something that's too big, you just can't push it. I mean, one thing that I would like to see maybe changed with Push is instead of it specifically saying large or smaller, maybe change it to say up to one size category larger than you or smaller. That would technically nerf small-sized races, but what it would do that would be beneficial is make it so that if you use something like Enlarge Person, then you become large, and then now you can push around huge-sized creatures, and that would increase the versatility of the ability, in my opinion. But in general, though, I feel like the main criticism I have for masteries in their current state is that we need more of them. Just so that we have more options and more general purpose options for just classes to do, and so that they have more choices to pick. So, just to give you some ideas off the top of my head, I think Baldur's Gate 3 actually had a few really good weapon properties that we could maybe poach and incorporate into the game. The Brace ability was pretty fun. Basically, the idea was that you would exchange some of your movement to get more damage, and that was a pretty good way of, I think, adding a simple damage trade-off that, like, it could root you in place. Like, maybe it costs all of your movement, but then you get bonus damage for the rest of your turn. Or maybe you could make it so that it just costs a fixed amount of movement that you can then spend for each of your attacks. Like, there's a number of ways that it could work. Pull would be an obvious counterpart to Push. That way, like, you would use it with probably reach-based weapons, and then you could pull enemies towards you. And then maybe an alternate sort of side advantage is that you could make it so that you could, if you push, or rather pull somebody into your own space, you can then move 5 feet, and then like that could let you swap places with them, or generally get a little bit more mobility out of it. Another one that you could probably take from Baldur's Gate would be the Rush ability, which is something that would essentially let you move as part of an attack and essentially give you more mobility. So like maybe as you attack, you can spend 5 feet of your movement to like run 10 or 15 feet in a straight line, and then that way you can effectively increase your move speed by attacking, and then that would fit really well with like lance type weapons, or maybe even some other piercing style weapons like a rapier or something. And then that would give you like like I said, just a general mobility enhancement. Like, even if you miss the attack, you still moved into position with it, which I think would be really nice. And I mean, like, a few of these could be adjusted. Like I said, with Push, it would be nice if it worked with bigger creatures circumstantially. I honestly feel like abilities like Cleave could maybe even work multiple times, or maybe even on if you use it on, like, different enemies or something. Like, in general, I feel like there's just... Like, these are all just ideas I've had off the top of my head. I feel like a team of designers working around the clock on the system could probably come up with more than 8 abilities, just to give the marshals more options to work with. But yeah, anyways, getting back on topic with the fighter, I think we should talk about the subclasses real quick. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail with this, since for the most part I really like it. The Battlemaster, I think, is really good. Again, one thing I don't think I touched on in my fighter video is the level 15 ability, which is really, really nice. It, essentially, once per turn, you can use a maneuver for free without spending a dice. And this actually has a few really interesting side effects that are not immediately obvious. So obviously during combat, it means that no matter what, you can always use maneuvers every turn, which is just good. But out of combat, if you take one of the utility abilities like Commanding Presence, which lets you spend a die to make intimidation, performance, or persuasion checks, that means that you can use Relentless and effectively always have the ability to add a die to those checks, which means that Battle Masters actually, ironically enough, become really, really good at certain skills that they can get bonuses to. Tactical Assessment is another one that gives you a bonus on history, investigation, or insight checks, which means that now, like, a fighter could be really, really insightful and be able to see through anyone's bullshit because they could just always get an extra D8 to any insight check, no matter what. And that's on top of the fact that if they fail a check, they can also use Tactical Mind by expending one of their second wins to get another D10 to the check. So they could be adding 2 really big die to a check to just kind of brute force their way through certain skills, and I think that's really cool. Moving on with, let's see here, Champion. I mean, Champion's boring. It is the generic subclass. Eldritch Knight, I already talked about extensively how much I love it. But the one class that we really need to talk about is the Brawler. Okay, so I was actually pretty positive on the Brawler during my first reading of it. It seemed like it was actually pretty cool and flavorful, lets you use improvised weapons and unarmed attacks and everything. But looking back on it with, with more insight, doing some playtesting and actually thinking about the mechanics of it and the math, Brawler is actually really bad. It's not that bad once you get to level 7 and above, because then you actually get some new abilities, but the primary issue with the subclass is that at level 3, the class is just playing catch-up with a base fighter. Like, if you think about it, the first ability, Unarmed Expert, all that Unarmed Expert does is make it so that at most you deal a d8 of damage with your unarmed strikes, which, for reference, is how much damage a normal longsword or battle axe does. Or a flail or anything like that. Which means that all that this ability does is make it so that an unarmed fighter is able to compete with just a normal fighter that uses a weapon. And even then, it's still technically worse, because if you want to use a shield, it gets reduced to a d6, whereas a normal fighter can use a battle axe or a longsword with a shield no problem. And then on top of that, the other level 3 ability, where you actually use improvised weapons, all it lets you do is apply weapon abilities to improvised weapons. So, like, you can apply, like, the thrown ability or reach, like normal weapons have. So, again, all that it really does is make improvised weapons, at most, as good as using normal weapons. And, again, even then, arguably worse, since a lot of these weapons can have multiple abilities to make them more interesting. So it's like... And then, again, the final ability is that you get to apply weapon masteries to improvised weapons, which, again, is something that normal weapons just have. So, like, at the end of the day, all of that, this entire, like, 3 or 4 paragraphs of text basically says is that a brawler fighter is as good at using unarmed attacks and improvised weapons as a normal fighter is at just using normal weapons without anything else extra on top of that. Because keep in mind, this is your subclass. Like, if you're a battle master, you're learning not only all your base fighter abilities, but also you're getting maneuvers and superiority dice. With your Eldritch Knight, you're getting spell casting and bonded weapons. But if you're a brawler, you're just getting the ability to be as good as a normal fighter, just with a slightly different fighting style. Like, it would literally be more effective to just be a battle master that fights unarmed than it would be to be an unarmed expert, because at least with the Battle Master you can apply maneuvers to like unarmed strikes and whatnot. So yeah, Brawler absolutely needs to be buffed, specifically by giving them something actually interesting at level 3 that is like something new that a normal fighter cannot do. So like, for example, maybe something as simple as like, you know, when you land an unarmed strike or a improvised weapon attack, you just deal, or rather you inflict a condition that gives the target disadvantage on grapple checks, so that way they become easier to grapple with subsequent attacks. So the idea is like you sucker punch someone, and then that makes it easier for you to grab them. That would make it so that it would combo well with the later abilities, like where you get grappling expert, and then dirty fighting and whatnot. So it would make you better at grappling, and it would be something that a normal fighter can't do. At least not by default. I mean, even a champion fighter, for example, gets advantage on athletics checks, which is used in grappling. So, like, ironically enough, the champion, the most boring fighter, is actually better at grappling than the fighter subclass that has dedicated multiple abilities to grappling. So, like, they need to get advantage or disadvantage on enemies or something that makes them better at grappling immediately at level 3 so that they can actually be better at it than other fighters. But that, at the end of the day, that's basically my main criticism with the fighter subclasses, and I think that'll wrap up what I have to say on fighters. So with that, I think we're going to have to move on to the Warlock. Okay, so the Warlock is, as usual for Warlocks, kind of weird. A lot of what they do now is actually really nice, and they've gotten a lot of buffs that make them really powerful, and that's all cool and well and good. But it's kind of awkward when taken into the context of the rest of the game, both in comparison to other classes, as well as when you take into account things like multi-classing. So I think that starting off, we need to talk more about Pact of the Blade. So one of the big changes that they made to Warlock is that now your packs, so Pact of the Blade, Pact of the Tome, all that good stuff, are now invocations that you can take, and you can take them at level 1. But Pact of the Blade really feels overtuned for something that you can take at level 1 with no prerequisites. Keep in mind, like, all of the things that Pact of the Blade lets you do is you can bound and summon any kind of weapon, and when you do that, you get proficiency with the weapon, so they effectively have proficiency with every weapon. Then on top of that, they get to use the mastery property of that weapon, which means that they effectively know every single weapon mastery, which feels kind of insulting to the fighter, who is supposed to get the most weapon masteries, and yet the Warlock is technically better at using them at level 1, at least in their current state. And then on top of that, you also get Charisma modifier to your attack and damage rolls, and then on top of that, you get the ability to change the weapon's damage type to either necrotic, psychic, or radiant damage, which basically makes it impossible to resist the weapon's damage, because how many enemies are you going to fight that are resistant to both physical damage and psychic damage and radiant and necrotic damage all at the same time? I mean, radiant and necrotic damage are like polar opposites. I don't even know if there are enemies that are resistant to both of those, let alone the others on top of that. So, like, you get so much out of Pact of the Blade at level 1, and that's before you buff it with things like Life Drinker and whatnot. So, I feel like there's a few changes that need to be made to Pact of the Blade. One, there needs to be a prerequisite on it. Now, the main reason for that actually comes down to feats. The Eldritch Adept feat lets you take an invocation from the Warlock as long as it doesn't have any prerequisites. So by not having any prerequisites on Pact of the Blade, that means that anybody can take this for free through a feat without even having to multi-class, which means that classes like Paladins and Bards can just casually pick up the ability to use Charisma damage, or Charisma and attacks, with melee weapons through just a feat without even multi-classing or losing any of their class progression, which I feel is a bit much. At the very least, they should have to multi-class in order to get something that powerful. So it definitely needs to have a prerequisite. And then one other thing I would change is make it so that the mastery property isn't included by default with Pact of the Blade. I would maybe separate that out into a different invocation that is maybe an invocation that lets you use mastery properties with your pact weapon, so that, you know, maybe you learn a mastery property and then any weapon that has that property you can use, or like you just choose to master a couple of weapons or something of that sort, just so that the Warlock can't use literally every mastery in the game for free at level 1. Like, it just seems kind of ridiculous that they would allow you to do that. Now, the other controversial aspect of Pact of the Blade is, of course, the third attack. You get... let's see here, where is it actually? Here it is. Thirsting Blade is another invocation you can take that gives you a second attack, and then at 11th level, you can get a third attack. I'm not necessarily opposed to this still, even after ruminating on it for a while. It really makes Pact of the Blade a lot more competitive with things like Eldritch Blast, especially since you can buff it further with things like Life Drinker, which just gives you a straight-up extra d6 in all of your hits. And you can still buff it further with things like Hex. So, maybe the extra attack at level 11, I feel like that should be 2 invocations. So the idea is that, like, you can take this Thirsting Blade at level 5 to get a second attack, and then there'd be, like, a, you know, even more improved Thirsting Blade or whatever at level 11 that would have this one as a prerequisite, and then that would be getting your third attack, just to kind of give it a little bit more of a tax. But the other thing is, of course, like I've said previously, if the Warlock is going to be getting 3 attacks like this, then all martial classes should be getting 3 attacks for free as part of their basic class progression. Like, we really need to be giving the Barbarian and Monk some more love at this point. Like, they need 3 attacks. But yeah, anyways, moving on to one other issue, and that is, of course, the rather infamous Eldritch Blast. We have to talk about Eldritch Blast. So, Eldritch Blast is a problematic cantrip, and that's just because it's a cantrip that is very clearly tied to the Warlock, but because it's a cantrip, it has a lot of weird properties that just make it so much more powerful than any other cantrip, and, you know, it just kind of warps the nature of the game almost by how powerful it is. People take Warlock levels just to get access to Eldritch Blast, and Eldritch Blast itself is just the way that you can use it to deal so much damage just is so easily exploitable. Like, I feel like the main reason why on the fighter, if we go back to the Eldritch Knight for a second, the War Magic ability that lets you cast a cantrip as part of your attack action, they specify that it has to be a wizard cantrip, and I'm willing to bet that the only reason why this is a thing is because they didn't want people to be able to cast Eldritch Blast in place of a single attack because of how absurdly broken and overpowered that would be. Like, if Eldritch Blast was not in the game, I almost guarantee that this idea of limiting it to wizard cantrips would not be a thing, because it just wouldn't matter. Like, what other cantrip could they possibly be worried about the Eldritch Knight casting? Like, the most powerful cantrips are already wizard cantrips, at least apart from Eldritch Blast. Like, Firebolt does d10s of damage. Toll the Dead, actually, is Toll the Dead a wizard cantrip? Either way. You also have Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, which do a ton of damage as well. Like, they already have way powerful cantrips. Like, what are they scared of the Eldritch Knight using if it's not Eldritch Blast? So, Eldritch Blast needs to be addressed, and I personally feel like the best way to do it is to just make it a class ability. If you're going to have this, you know, spell that's so tied to the Warlock, why are we, you know, footing around with it being a cantrip when we could just call it a day and make it a class ability that scales with class levels? So, like, so for example, you could just make it a simple level 1 ability, and then at level 5, 11, and 17, it gets better, and that would be at Warlock levels rather than class levels. But what I think would be way cooler is if we actually made it a subclass ability. So, for example, maybe at level 3, that's when you get Eldritch Blast, and you get it from your patron. So each patron could then give you a slightly different version of Eldritch Blast, which is more tailored to the patron's, style and themings, which could give you a lot more flavor and maybe even fill up some holes in the design for some of the patrons. So, like, for example, to talk about the subclasses, since we're now on that topic, I like the new Archfey subclass a lot, but they focus a lot on teleportation and stuff, and they've kind of lost the sort of charm and fear effects that the old Archfey patron was known for, and that's a common trope with Fey. So maybe what you could do is take the Eldritch Blast, and if you're an Archfey Warlock, then maybe Eldritch Blast has a secondary effect where creatures hit by it have to make a saving throw or be charmed or feared, and that could be a cool, flavorful thing. The Celestial Patron, maybe instead of getting extra attacks, you hit somebody and deal damage to them, and then you choose an ally, and they get temporary hit points equal to the amount of damage you dealt to your target. For the Fiend, I imagine the Fiend would probably be the most like the classic version of Eldritch Blast, where it just does as much damage as possible and focuses on getting multiple attacks so you can hit more people with it. And then maybe the Great Old One does psychic damage, and it could have various debuffs included in it, like giving you penalties to attack rolls and saving throws, like Vicious Mockery and Mind Sliver. And maybe as you level up, you get more and more debuffs that are applied to it instead of more attacks, or maybe in addition to more attacks. And maybe at a capstone ability, it can even apply like a confusion effect. I think that in general, this would just be a lot more flavorful way of handling Eldritch Blast, and then that way you just make it scale with your subclass levels. So like at level 3, you get the base version. At level 6, you get your upgrade, and that would be when you get like a second attack or things like that. At level 10, you could get your third attack or your third, upgrade that gives you secondary things. Level 14, and so on and so forth. Like, there are... I think this would just be a lot more cool and flavorful, and it would just solve so many problems that Eldritch Blast creates with multi-classing and things like that, because like no other cantrip has this problem. Like, cantrips in general aren't actually that strong. A lot of people say 5e cantrips are too powerful. I disagree with that, as long as you're not talking about Eldritch Blast. And the other cool thing that this could do is actually make it so that the invocations are more interesting. Like, one thing that they've been changing with invocations is making it so that things like Agonizing Blast and Eldritch Spear no longer are tied specifically to Eldritch Blast. You can now apply them to any cantrip. But the problem is that Eldritch Blast is so strong, even if you're just playing a Warlock without multi-classing, that it kind of ruins these abilities. Because it's like, yeah, Agonizing Blast, I can get Charisma bonus to any cantrip, but why would I pick anything but Eldritch Blast when most cantrips only deal one attack, and thus you only get your Charisma bonus added a single time, whereas Eldritch Blast can do up to 4 attacks, and thus get my Charisma bonus added 4 times. Like, that's not even min-maxing at that point, it's just common sense. So, like, I feel like if you make it so that Eldritch Blast by default is already getting all these flavorful abilities and upgrades and whatnot through your subclass, then you don't even need to make it so that these invocations can apply to Eldritch Blast anymore. Like, you could have it built in that Eldritch Blast does Charisma bonus to damage, or increases its range or whatnot from your subclass abilities, and then these can exclusively work with other cantrips, so that now Agonizing Blast can be useful with any cantrip, and that way you can do cool things. Like, one idea I've really enjoyed is the idea of using Pact of the Tome, and flavorful, make it so that my tome is actually like a joke book, and like I'm like an Archfey Warlock that uses Vicious Mockery to just insult people to death, and then I could take things like Agonizing Blast to make it deal more damage, and Eldritch Spear so that I can insult people from 600 feet away, and just like imagining, somebody standing like a football field away and just yelling an insult at you that just stings so hard that you die and your corpse gets thrown back like 30 feet. Like, there's a lot of fun things that you could do if you actually use these abilities on cantrips that I think would open up a lot more variety in how people play the Warlock if Eldritch Blast was no longer the most optimal damage option. Because, yeah, like, other than maybe with the Fiend Patron, with this version of Eldritch Blast that I'm suggesting, Eldritch Blast wouldn't necessarily always deal the most damage. Like I said, with the Celestial, it probably wouldn't get extra attacks. It would have other secondary effects that would be useful. So, like, it wouldn't deal the most damage anymore, and you'd actually have a reason to use other cantrips for damage output. Not to mention that you could probably add more invocations that can better affect more kinds of cantrips. Like, maybe, like, Repelling Blast currently is locked only to Eldritch Blast for whatever reason, but you could probably change that to make it so that it works with any cantrip that requires an attack roll. So that now, you can use Firebolts or Acid Splash or whatever and hit people and knock them back with it. You could have a different one that only works on cantrips that require a saving throw instead. And I could see one that maybe increases the area of effect of the handful of cantrips that do that. Because, like, for example, you have a Blade Burst or Sacred Radiance, I think it's called, that deal damage, in a 5-foot burst centered on yourself. And so maybe you could have an invocation that could increase that to like a 10 or even 15-foot burst, to make that more interesting. Like, there's a lot of cool ways that I think you could buff other cantrips as a Warlock that would give them more interesting flavor if you just made it so that they didn't have to rely on Eldritch Blast so much. But yeah, I think that is just about to do it. Like I said, a lot of my problems with Warlock mostly have to do with the greater context of the game they exist in. As for the subclasses, I mean, I kind of already touched on them. I still think that giving Eldritch Blast to them would allow them to be a lot more flavorful, but as they exist currently, I think their current abilities are pretty good. Fiend does a lot of damage, Celestial lets you heal stuff. I really like the teleporting aspect of the Fae, though, like I said, I do wish they had more charm and fear effects. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for the Warlock, and for that matter, I think that's going to wrap up my summary of my criticism for Playtest 7. So, like I said, remember that you can go to the D&D Beyond website, and if you go to the Playtest Packet section, then you can go to the Unearthed Arcana section, go to your Player's Handbook Playtest 7, and then you click on that, and then you can go straight to the survey, and then that will let you give your thoughts to Wizards of the Coast. So, like I said, if you have any criticisms that you want to discuss, maybe get some more feedback on, feel free to leave me a comment down below, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation down there. And if you agree or disagree with any of the criticisms I've said, by all means, feel free to let me know. I'll probably wait a few days before I turn in my own survey, so that I can continue to talk about this with some of my friends and you people down in the comments, so that I can better refine what my criticisms are, because I want to give Wizards the best feedback I can, so that hopefully this game that I love playing can be the best version of itself that it can be. And so with that, I think that I'm going to have to sign off, and I think I'll talk to you guys later.